All right, well, we have quite a bit to cover today, so let's go ahead and dive right in. So welcome again, everyone, to today's webinar on creating a carbon fund. This webinar is organized by the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative in partnership with EcoShift Consulting. And my name is Julia Kim. I'm a project manager at the Local Government Commission, one of 3 collaborative NGO partners with the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative, or SEEC, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. A quick overview of today's agenda. I will first provide a brief intro to SEEC for those of you who may not be familiar with the program. Then to our feature, well, first we'll go over webinar logistics, and then onto our feature presentation on creating a carbon fund. Tiffany Wise-West from EcoShift Consulting will highlight different revenue models and which may best suit your municipality, details on how to set up a carbon fund, including a breakdown of steps and an overview of typical implementation challenges, as well as case study examples of funds that have been designed or implemented within the past 3 years, and highlighting operational experiences, successes, and challenges. Then we'll wrap up with audience Q&A, and we're planning to dedicate at least 20 minutes to that portion. So there should be plenty of time to engage in the conversation. So what is SEEC? SEEC is an alliance between 3 statewide NGOs, ICLEI, Institute for Local Government, and Local Government Commission, as well as California's for Investor and Utilities. And together, we support local governments in their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, save energy, and accelerate their climate action efforts. And we do this through a number of different resources and services. Some of our core programs include ICLEI's ClearPath tools, their suite of tools for climate action planning and forecasting, the Institute for Local Government's Beacon Recognition Program, as well as LGC's annual Statewide Energy Efficiency Forum, which was held last week in Fresno, which I'm sure I saw many of you there. In addition to the 3 NGOs and the investor and utilities, we also have a statewide local government energy efficiency best practices coordinator, who is Carrie Garcia, and he provides targeted assistance and resources for local governments throughout the state. And just to highlight a few recent initiatives, LGC developed a ZeroNet Energy Hub, which compiles all existing resources on ZeroNet energy planning and implementation on one easy-to-navigate web page. It's really kind of to create a one-stop shop for all things ZeroNet energy related for local governments. So great page to check out. We'll make sure we include the link in the follow-up. And then another opportunity I wanted to highlight are the local government roundtables that we are hosting. So these are topic-focused calls. They're convened by conference calls. They're initially reserved for only local government staff and officials to participate, although some roundtables have chosen to expand, to invite industry experts into the roundtable. Currently, we have active roundtables on street lighting, and we're ramping up to start climate action planning and stakeholder engagement. So again, we'll share that info out as follow-up and hope that you'll engage. And then you can also propose any new topic-focused roundtables that you might be interested in. So just to go over some webinar logistics before we get started, everyone will be muted except for our panelists. And typically, due to the large number of participants, we ask that folks submit their questions through the question panel so that I can kind of compile them and share that with our panelists during the Q&A portion. But I think this time I really want to try the hand raising feature. I'll leave both options open for everyone. So if you maybe don't have stable connection, or you don't have a working mic connected to your computer, you feel free to type your questions into the question panel at any point, and I'll make sure those are directed to Tiffany. But then during the Q&A portion, when we kick things off, you can use the hand raising feature of the control panel, and then I'll go ahead and unmute you, and you can engage directly with our panelists. There's also a chat feature, and if you're running into any technical difficulties, for example, you're having a hard time hearing me, you're having a hard time hearing Tiffany, there are some issues with what you're seeing on your screen, you can either send me a chat directly targeting it to organizers only, or you can also just send a question in through the question panel if that's easier for you. And then a couple additional things to note. After the webinar wraps up, we'll share a link to the recording of the webinar as well as a PDF attachment of the presentation today. And then any questions that we're not able to get to, we'll make sure they're addressed at least briefly through written responses from Tiffany. All right, now I'm excited to introduce our webinar presenter. Tiffany Wise-West is a licensed professional civil engineer and lead associate professional experienced in green municipal infrastructure project design and management. Dr. Wise-West complements her technical skill set with policy, regulatory, and economic expertise in the areas of climate and energy, sustainability, energy efficiency, renewable energy, microgrid systems, and sustainable transportation. She specializes in developing and managing public-private academic partnerships aimed at advancing green infrastructure policy and programming. Thanks so much for being with us here today, Tiffany.
Thank you very much. Are you able to see my screen?
I'm switching over control to you right now.
Okay, very good. Okay. And how are we there?
Looks great.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm really pleased to share with participants on this call today EcoShift's experience with developing and implementing a number of carbon funds in California and beyond. I've actually added one that's outside of California that we recently worked on. I think we have almost 150 participants on this call that appear to be mostly from local government, but I also see some nonprofits, universities, and other agencies on the line as well. And you know what we'll talk about today, some of the models will apply to to local government and to other agencies that are listening in. Some may be more appropriate than others for, say, nonprofits or whatnot, but I am going to show you some models that are implemented by local governments and nonprofits. And you know, much of what we talk about today can also be applied to the private sector. Many of you may have seen our poster last week on carbon funds at the SEEC forum, so I hope that that maybe triggered some interest in this webinar. The first thing let's see here. Just one moment, having an issue advancing my my PowerPoint, so bear with me for just a moment while I try to troubleshoot here. Okay, so continuing on here, one thing that I wanted to mention is that the first version of this webinar was presented in December of 2015 as part of an effort by our Monterey Bay Regional Climate Action Compact. This version that I'm showing to you is more updated, but that compact is administered by a nonprofit called the Offset Project, and they manage the Monterey Bay Carbon Fund that I'll present today. So I just wanted to mention that you know, this is the second version of this webinar. Apologies, having a little trouble advancing this.
I can try to take over control. I don't know if you're able to grant me keyboard and mouse access in the control panel.
I'm not sure here. Okay, here we go. Very good. All right, so what is a carbon fund? You know, there are many terms for a carbon fund. Carbon fund is just a general term that we use. We also see carbon funds referred to as sustainability funds, green funds, energy efficiency funds, but generally it's a mechanism to generate contributions or fees to fund emissions reducing initiatives or in some cases to fund the purchase of offsets. These carbon funds are obviously integrated into organizations' operations, and the funds are dispersed according to a codified set of rules and a process that's in place, which we will talk about today. There are direct and indirect ways in which a carbon fund can be populated, or rather funds put into it. I've noted a few here as the revenue streams, and we'll talk about many of these today. Some agencies assess a carbon impact fee. Carbon funds can also capture grant dollars, as well as energy efficiency savings and rebates. And we're even discussing with one of our clients an internal energy and fuel surcharge fee. And we are starting to look at some newer revenue streams, potential revenue streams, such as CAPCOA's greenhouse gas emissions exchange, where credits can be purchased by, say, developers who need CEQA credits, as well as the state's low carbon fuel standard credit program. It's starting to evaluate those. And then, of course, these can fund carbon reduction projects like renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other climate related projects that may or may not reduce carbon. As we'll see later on, different agencies have different stances on how strict they want to be on whether funds can be utilized for, say, capacity building, staffing, and so forth, or if they need to go directly to, say, a direct emissions reducing project like a solar PV installation. So some benefits of the carbon fund. First of all, we know that municipalities in particular are constrained by capacity and funding to meet their local goals. And we also know that implementation of all the local government climate action plans that have been developed over the past decade have been constrained by funding. So one of the top things that we say, the benefits of developing and implementing a carbon fund, is to enhance your ability to implement your climate action plan and achieve your local goals, as well as contribute to state goals. Also, as I've already mentioned, these funds can be enable you to increase your renewable energy generation capacity or your energy efficiency efforts. These kind of projects also can support a community choice energy program, or a CCA, CCE, if you have that in place, by reducing the amount of energy that must be procured on the market and enabling an increased greener portfolio at competitive pricing. We also see the dollars that are coming in through the various revenue streams used as potential matching funds, which enables agencies to compete for major grants at both the federal and state level. Also, for entities that are subject to AB 32 compliance, a carbon fund can help to procure offsets or to reduce emissions through other carbon reducing activities. And lastly, in the Monterey Bay area, where we're located, we especially like to highlight the importance of keeping the money local and supporting our green workforce, which here in the Monterey Bay area, as I'm sure across the state of California, we have a really strong green workforce that we look to support. So moving on, before sharing kind of the steps, I wanted to talk about the keys for success that we've observed in the, we've worked on maybe a half dozen or so carbon funds over the past few years. And these are the kind of common attributes or common factors that we've observed that lead to successful fund development and implementation. First of all, the process of developing the fund needs to be inclusive and transparent, meaning you need to involve from perhaps your board of directors or your board of supervisors or city council, all the way down to your staff level, because truly all levels within an organization are involved. Now, for local governments, that also means involving the community and reporting to the community and providing opportunities for the community to engage and perhaps provide input. Of course, transparency is key as well. We really strive to provide chronological documentation of fund development, so all of the decision points are documented in case there is ever a question. Secondly, I think it's very important to really demonstrate not only the carbon savings, but the business case for development of the fund, for implementation of such a fund. And we will take a look at, some different ways that EcoShift has estimated both the cost, the revenue that can be generated through a fund, as well as the cost savings of the types of projects that will be funded. So that's a really important point. The dollars and the carbon reduction really speak volumes. We also have found that, due to capacity limitations, it really is essential to provide as simplified a process as possible and to minimize the administrative burden of developing and implementing a fund. We know that, not all agencies have staff that are specifically tasked with sustainability or climate action. In some cases, this type of fund gets absorbed into a planning department or a building department. And so really keeping it simple is pretty key. I've already kind of mentioned the engaging internal and external stakeholders. How we do that is we like to, as I mentioned, document as well as provide kind of a project fact sheet that can be updated periodically and can be used as a talking point, both internal and external to the organization. Next, you need to ensure that whichever revenue model or revenue stream that's selected is sustainable. And I'll give you an example there. The city of Santa Cruz, for example, puts all their rebates that they receive from energy efficiency projects into their carbon fund. Yet they also know that those rebates will have diminishing returns over the years, because as more energy efficiency projects are undertaken, there are less opportunities. So that's important to less opportunity for more energy efficiency. So it's really important to understand the longevity that can be expected from a revenue stream. And I have a really good example of that, which was unanticipated with the Watsonville Carbon Fund that I'll talk about in just a moment. And then last, it's crucially important to ensure that there is a policy in place, whether that's an ordinance or an administrative procedural order or whatnot, that outlines how funds are collected and how they're distributed. Obviously, there needs to be transparency, and having those policies in place really allows for that transparency. Okay, so moving on to some examples. I wanted to start with the city of Watsonville. The city of Watsonville has a pretty unique carbon fund in that they assess a carbon impact fee on almost all new development. And there are two tracks that this can take. You can see on the left-hand side that the applicant can pay the carbon impact fee and go on their merry way of obtaining their permits and building their project. That carbon impact fee gets directed to the carbon fund and then funds implementation of climate action projects, thus reducing emissions. The other track that developers can take is that they can pay the fee and they can install renewable energy at, there's two different thresholds, 40% to meet 40% or 80% of electricity demand. And if they do that, then they are eligible to receive a full or partial fee refund. that intention of that refund is to reduce the payback on the solar PV system. So that is an incentive to build clean energy buildings. So as you can see in both pathways, we are achieving greenhouse gas emissions. So some details on their fund. It was established in late 2015. In its first year, they generated $80,000 in revenue, which was actually very close to what we had projected for revenue based on previous years' development permit fees. The fee itself is a proportion of the building permit fee. And as far as how funds are distributed, Watsonville allows staff to make proposals. Proposals need to be aligned with the climate action plan projects that had been prioritized. Watsonville's climate action plan was developed concurrently with the carbon fund. So those were dovetailed together. And then the proposals from staff get prioritized by city executives and approved. Their fund is administered by their planning department, and their finance department was really crucial to set up the workflow for how funds make it into the account. So setting up the account and accounting for fees and refunds. I give you the website here where you can see some of the materials that were developed, like a frequently asked questions sheet, a worksheet for developers to determine, what size of system they need to install, how much the fee is going to be, and some other materials. And that's the city of Watsonville. Next, we have the city of Santa Cruz. Oh, I wanted to mention one other thing on the city of Watsonville before I move on. This is kind of one of those things to watch out for. One of the things we had to be careful with the city of Watsonville's carbon fund was to make sure not to trigger REACH code requirements with the California Energy Commission, which would necessitate their approval as well as a cost effectiveness study. And by making solar PV optional, that allowed us to avoid the CEC considering this program a REACH code. So that is something to remember, that when you are going above and beyond energy code, that you do need to get CEC approval. Okay, moving on to the city of Santa Cruz. They are looking at a two-phased carbon fund, in that they are implementing different revenue streams at different time periods. Their phase one revenue streams were, and the carbon fund itself was put in place in late 2016, so it's rather new. And in the phase one, we established the account, and they are directing their energy efficiency rebates, utility credits, and grants towards this dedicated fund. It was codified through an administrative procedural order. And I think in the first year, it's anticipated that over $75,000 of revenue will be generated. And they're looking at, in phase two, to expand the revenue streams to include potentially fuel surcharges on gasoline and diesel. So something between maybe a 1 and 5 cent tax per gallon, as well as diverting 50% of year one energy efficiency savings into the fund. So departments would budget for a normal year of energy purchasing and divert half the savings into the carbon fund. The city is also exploring a couple different newish mechanisms that I mentioned at the start of the webinar, the CAPCO greenhouse gas exchange, as well as the low carbon fuel standard credit sales. And so they're doing some evaluation right now to understand whether those are viable and worthwhile to pursue. As far as how the funds are distributed, proposals are brought forward by city staff. They are prioritized by the city's sustainability team, and where high priority is carbon reductions. Not to say that non-carbon reducing projects don't get funded, things like maybe education or outreach, but we do prioritize carbon reduction. And then projects are brought forward to the city manager for approval, and then are presented to city council. In their first round of project funding, they funded the last portion needed for a boiler replacement that was on their CIP since 1988, believe it or not. It's also funding a tree canopy study, which aligns with one of their climate action goals. It's also providing micro grants for green business certification of city offices and businesses, and also is providing controls for a new pool pump that was being funded by a CEC loan, but didn't include controls. So able to really, finish up some projects and make the difference in the last mile of some of these projects. Moving on to UC Santa Cruz. Yes.
If I could just interrupt just for one moment with a couple questions specifically on City of Santa Cruz and their efforts. So one question we received is if you could please elaborate on why one would not want to trigger a CEC reach code, as it just doesn't seem immediately evident.
Sure. So that was for Watsonville, and the REACH code requires a cost effectiveness study, which can be quite expensive, and requires CEC approval that takes several months. That was something that we wanted to avoid. It's definitely not a hurdle that is not insurmountable. I mean, you can certainly go through the REACH code process. That was something that we wanted to avoid. It was going to adversely affect our timeline. And we also, at that point, we had assessed, I should mention, a variety of options for the city of Watsonville. They wanted to initially produce offsets that could be sold from wetlands restoration. We also looked at like refrigerant leakage offset development, but found that the volume would be too low to make it worthwhile to go through that expensive process. So what I was getting at is at the point when we realized that we couldn't make this a mandatory solar type thing, that was okay because we wanted the fee anyway. That was kind of the point. So for us, it wasn't a big deal, but for others it could be. And it's just a point that I wanted to bring out that, it is something you have to be mindful of, the REACH code. And we did consult with the CEC on this to make sure that, what we were proposing didn't require their approval, and, that was fine.
Great. Just a couple more questions, and then I'll let you continue. While you're on the City of Watsonville slide, actually, are you aware of any other agencies that assess a carbon impact fee? And you might be covering this in your next slide.
No, I'm not. This was rather novel when it was developed in 2015. We couldn't find anyone else in the state that was doing this exact model. So no, I don't know of anyone else who is assessing a carbon impact fee.
Great, thank you. And then last one, and this is for the City of Santa Cruz. Are the fuel surcharges just for municipal fuel purchasing?
Yes, definitely. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear, but yes, that it's definitely just on municipal fleet fuel purchases. Good point. Thank you for whoever asked that question to allow me to clarify that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So continuing on, UC Santa Cruz, they established their carbon fund in 2010. So it is the oldest of all of those that I'm going to present today. And they have a little bit different of a model. Their students voted to assess themselves a $3 per quarter fee that went into this carbon fund. But the carbon fund has also been expanded to allow for voluntary community contributions. And one interesting mechanism that is coming into that fund is that the city of Santa Cruz found that they could recommend a donation to the fund as an alternative compliance mechanism when developers fail to properly divert construction waste. So that's another revenue stream that's coming in. It's not a huge revenue stream. It's probably on the order of less than 10K a year, but that also is a revenue stream that's coming in to this particular fund. They also have a capital campaign that they have been able to allow donors to specify donations to go directly into this fund. However, I would say the vast majority of the fund is revenue from the student fee measure. They generate over $120,000 a year through this fund. They have a superb track record of emissions avoidance and reductions. Interestingly enough, the fund distribution is a competitive grant process, a two-step grant process that's available not only to students, staff, and faculty, but also to community members, which makes this kind of unique. One of, just like the other funds, one of the priorities is carbon reduction and involvement of students. So they see a lot of projects come in that will potentially provide a stipend for student interns to do some aspect of the work. However, since UCSC is subject to AB 32 compliance and they are facing some big costs related to that, they have started to really try to focus on-campus emissions reductions. So we're seeing fewer community grants being made. And this fund is administered through the UCSC Sustainability Office, which I believe is a unit of the business and procurement. And you can check out more about that fund at their website. I wanted to also clarify that, as I mentioned, it's kind of a two-step process. The fund provides early grants to projects that are less than $5,000. So they open up the grant process in the fall, and by December, those that are proposing less than $5,000 in projects, those that are getting awards are notified. Then for those that are proposing more than a $5,000 project, they go on to a second phase application and proposal process. It's a little more expanded than the first, and find out usually in late January, early February of the next year as to whether the award has been made. The average award size for UC Santa Cruz is about, I think, $15,000, but they make grants, on the order of a couple $100 to, I think their maximum grant size has been $64,000. And then we have the Monterey Bay Carbon Fund. That fund was established in 2012. To date, it's generated over $600,000 in revenue that has gone out to the local community. It funds competitive grants, but primarily it funds grants to schools for solar PV and energy efficiency, as well as community electric vehicle charging stations. This fund is administered by the Offset Project, as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, which is a nonprofit agency. They have a web portal that has a carbon calculator, which EcoShift developed, and you can purchase offsets right on the website. Also, this fund allows for individuals to offset, their emissions that they produce from travel and waste and so forth. But this fund is also used regularly by organizations like the Professional Golfers Association to offset emissions from tournaments. They also receive offsets for big events like music festivals and marathons. They also have negotiated with hotels in the region a $1 a night fee, carbon fee, that goes into the fund, that hotels and these other organizations have built these fees into their ticket pricing. And they're looking at establishing some relationships with airports as well to offer a local offset for travel. They really also strive to leverage public-private partnerships. As an example, for the Solar for Schools projects that are funded, they partner with an organization called Rancho Cielo that provides workforce training in solar PV installation to high school students, who then move on to good paying jobs after graduating from high school. So a little bit different of a fund. Anyone can contribute to this fund. However, the Offset Project has developed relationships with a number of, tourism and other types of organizations that I already mentioned. And then the last fund that I wanted to present is actually outside of California. It was designed for the Western North Carolina Green Building Council. It's called Appalachian Offsets. This is just a screenshot of the webpage, the landing page for this carbon fund. You can see that there are both individual and business calculators that allow for estimation of carbon emissions generated from various activities. EcoShift built both these calculators for Appalachian Offsets. And how this fund works, it's pretty similar to the Monterey Bay Carbon Fund. They receive voluntary contributions which are paid for on the website. So there is a Stripe payment feature on the calculator web pages. And so again, both individuals and businesses can offset their emissions. And Western North Carolina Green Building Council they had actually launched this program 3 years ago, and it stagnated, and they decided to do a completely new rebranding, launching this website, and a new outreach campaign that they have launched. And so this just had been completed in August of 2016. They've generated $18,000 to date. And I'm showing the emissions avoidance. What they are funding is energy efficiency and solar PV for nonprofits. As we probably all know, nonprofits aren't eligible for the federal tax credit. So this kind of helps to make the payback and the cost burden lower for nonprofits. So again, this is administered by the Western North Carolina Green Building Council, and you can check out their website on cutmycarbon.org. They got a really nifty website and are really actively in the throes of their campaign to generate revenue to put towards energy efficiency and solar PV for nonprofits. Okay, so those are a few examples. Next, I just wanted to share with you the steps on establishing a carbon fund. So it's important to set forth the priorities and parameters of the fund. For example, the limitation on organizational capacity is a very real issue to be mindful of. Whether you want strictly carbon reducing projects, or if education, outreach, and other kind of non-direct emissions type projects are acceptable. Secondly, I think it's very crucial to brainstorm and assess potential revenue opportunities. As I mentioned for Watsonville, we looked at offset generation, we looked at maybe establishing a voluntary carbon fund similar to the Monterey Bay and Appalachian offset funds, you know, and really started to funnel down to what was feasible, how much could we expect to generate. You know, we needed to be able to generate enough dollars to make it worthwhile to implement such a program. It's really important to also assess the political will and the process to implement each potential revenue stream. You know, one thing with Watsonville that I was kind of surprised that we didn't encounter was developer resistance. We held 2 outreach workshops for developers and really didn't hear much pain from them. So that was, you know, an unexpected, pleasant surprise. But we did have a technical advisory committee for Watsonville who was really keenly aware of what was politically possible and what wasn't. And so that was very helpful. In addition to assessing political will, it is important to do that stakeholder engagement, again, the developers and the community, to ensure that, you know, what you're proposing is appropriate and doesn't cause any undue burden on any particular population. And then once you have kind of done those first 4 steps, and those steps are, for us, are always an iterative process, you know, going back and revising, refining, vetting, and after that, though, you can select, design, and launch your program. As I mentioned before, it's really important to craft a policy that defines the rules, the process, and the timeline. And you know, we have several examples of those, as well as to conduct outreach and internal training. As you can imagine, and as I've mentioned, there are a number of you know, departments that need to be involved in development of such a fee. So, and in the implementation, or I shouldn't say of a fee, development of a fund and implementation of a fund. And so it's really crucial to do that internal training, make sure that everyone knows what's going on. And then as far as managing the carbon fund once it's launched, you know, you do need to plan for fiscal accounting and how you're going to select projects. So in terms of fiscal accounting, most of the funds that we've worked with do an annual reporting on how they've spent their funds. Usually the agencies, electeds have already seen the projects, you know, either through approving them or through FYIs. The project selection process, I think, can be really fun and is a great way to get your staff involved. I think that it's important to establish some rubrics for how projects get prioritized and selected. And we have some examples of that as well. In that timeline that you have developed when you're developing your fund itself, you will have identified when you will solicit carbon reducing project proposals. Most of the groups that we work with do that once a year. And then at that time, you can select and implement projects to achieve real carbon reductions. And, you know, most agencies do require that the proposers of projects report back when the project is implemented, and some require reporting after 1 year on as to whether the estimates of savings or I guess basically savings, how that compared to the actual savings of, say, an energy efficiency project, or to report on some other metrics, you know, number of events where outreach was conducted or whatnot. UCSC in particular has a very stringent reporting process and has an online platform where where projects and their status are required to be updated. And last, I want to leave you with a call to action. really hope that this inspires some exploratory discussions as to how you might implement a fund for climate action. Again, it's, I think, crucial to start from the bottom up and the top down at the same time to assess the, the pulse of your agency, its ability to develop and launch a fund, and whether you have management and executive buy-in. Conducting an opportunity analysis doesn't need to be a super arduous task by any means. Excuse me for a moment. Rough order of magnitude is good as a starting point. Once you have that completed, you can establish the fund and get management approval. Excuse me, rally your stakeholders and manage and implement your fund. So some of our work on carbon funds, as well as others, will be in the July issue of Western Cities magazine. And with that, I'll take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tiffany. We do have a few questions that have been submitted, and then it looks like we have at least one person using the hand raising feature. So folks on the line, feel free to use that hand raising feature. You can type your questions in. So how do you establish the amounts for development fees? And is that process related to the offset charges in the cap and trade auction or another similar standard?
I'm sorry, did you say the fee development?
Yeah, so how do you establish the amounts for development fees?
Yeah, that's a great question. We started with, we looked at this in several ways for Watsonville. We looked at it first as a percent of the project valuation, which we realized would not probably be appropriate, and rather we presented a number of percentages of the building permit fee. So we looked at 1%, I think up to 5%, and landed on, unfortunately, a fairly low, something I think around 1.5% of the building permit fee. We had recommended a higher percentage, but that technical advisory committee was really sensitive to what developers could handle on top of, as you all know, high permitting fees for any kind of development. So that was really an iterative process. It was not tied to AB 32 in any way. It was strictly tied to the building permit fee.
Great, and if you wanted to, I know you've just presented for 40 minutes. If you wanted to grab some water, if that might help, and we can take a quick 1-minute break.
I've got water here. I'm good to go.
Okay,
I'm
perfect.
good now.
Just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, a few more questions. So do these types of fees require a nexus study? So for example, commercial housing linkage fees that charge developers of new commercial projects a fee to fund affordable housing must conduct a nexus study to justify that there is a link between the fee and what it is to be used for, or else the city faces litigation. Is a nexus study ever done, and is there a risk of litigation for imposing a carbon fee?
We did not complete any nexus study. I don't think that there was an issue with that. I know that Watsonville's attorneys were involved in reviewing the ordinance and so forth, but I don't have familiarity with that, and that was not an issue that was brought up, and I don't think has been brought up since. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's anything else I could say on that, but thank you for bringing that up. That's something I definitely will look into.
All right. Before I dive into additional questions that were submitted, I'm going to try the hand raising feature. So Corey, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Great. Well, I just did it because I wanted to try this feature too. I've been on so many webinars and never had a chance to try this hand-raising feature. My question is, we are updating our climate action plan in San Rafael right now, and we gave kind of short shrift to climate equity and the economy in our first version, and I really want to beef that up. And one thought that I was considering was using a carbon fund to be able to enable folks in low-income neighborhoods or with low-income properties or multifamily units to be able to access the fund to do projects. And I'm wondering if that's ever been discussed in any of the carbon fund discussions that you've had with folks, and whether there's any learnings that I can get from that.
Sure. Right now the city of Santa Cruz is discussing, they're coming up on their second round of project proposals. So they did their first round in the fall of last year. Their second round's coming up, and there has been discussion about doing just such a project. We have in Santa Cruz a multifamily affordable live-work space for artists. And we know that solar hot water heating would be a great project there. The state rebates would probably make this very close to being a neutral cost kind of situation. And we are trying to help them assess as to whether they would need some additional funds, and if so, they could propose it through their carbon fund. So that is one example. I don't know that necessarily any of these other funds have funded low income or other types of projects. That's the only one I'm really aware of. I mean, aside from Appalachian Offsets, does do solar PV and energy efficiency for nonprofits, who typically, I think, are benefiting some disadvantaged folks in their community. So that's the experience I have. I think that's a great idea. I know that the city of Santa Cruz is really taking environmental justice and social equity very seriously, much more so than when their climate action plan was developed in 2012. So I'd say kudos and go for it. And let's keep in touch on how it goes.
Great, thanks so much, Tiffany. Muting you again, Corey, and Sean, I'm going to unmute you for your question. Hi, Sean, are you still there?
Yes, can you hear me?
We're getting a lot of background noise. All right, we're going to try that again in a minute. A couple additional questions for you, Tiffany. Are any funds supporting non-resource reducing activities like gardening or tree planting?
Yes, indirectly. The City of Santa Cruz Fund, as I mentioned, is funding a tree canopy study. They have a goal to expand tree canopy, but they don't even have a baseline as to what it is. So that's kind of an indirect thing with supporting tree planting. Most of what we have seen that is non-resource reduction related is been around education and outreach, education events, some stuff related to climate adaptation as well, which doesn't necessarily have emissions reduction component, but is equally as important as carbon mitigation.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. Another question, you mentioned UC Santa Cruz had a robust online platform for managing their energy efficiency projects where they track and report. Is this the Sustainable Endowment Institution's GRITS tool or another tool that was developed?
Well, they do use GRITS, but this is actually just an online clearinghouse that they require their fund recipients or awardees to maintain on the project so that there's always a current listing of the project and its status on their website. Some of the projects that they award are multi-year projects, and sometimes students move on and pass them on to a new cohort of students that are involved, or a new team. And so it was a way for them to establish, I guess, some consistency in making sure that they always have the most up-to-date information. And so they're pretty adamant about making sure that award recipients maintain this clearinghouse or risk jeopardizing their funding. So it's not related to grits, although they do grits reporting, I know.
Wonderful. And have any cities explored issuing a green bond to provide the revenue stream for a carbon fund?
Yeah, you know, the city of Santa Cruz just recently considered, I mean, I work really closely with them, so, you know, I know a lot about their situation in particular, but I'm not sure about others. But City of Santa Cruz looked at green bonds to fund some municipal solar PV, like $4 million in projects, but realized that by doing some internal financing, they probably could get better rates. So I actually have not seen in any of our clients or any of the Monterey Bay area local governments utilizing green bonds for those types of projects. However, I was just at the CDP local government conference about 6 months ago, where green bonds was all the rage, and there was a lot of interest there. So it's something that I think should be evaluated, but I don't have experience with that right now.
Great, thanks so much, Tiffany. At this point, we don't have any additional questions that I see. Oh, there's one coming in. So what sort of capacity would a small city need to implement and manage a green revolving fund or carbon fund if they only have one city planner?
Well, the city of Watsonville, theirs was really, I would say, the simplest kind of thing that required the most minimal administrative capacity. What it required for them was a planner to be involved in the development process, which occurred concurrent to the climate action plan development. So it went along a kind of a longer timeline than it really needed to. But once that was in place, once the fund itself was in place, it really became absorbed into the operations of the planning and building department and finance. And so they do have the only, I think, ongoing planner related administration that would be required is for when projects are proposed, and then following up on projects, which appears to be, from my experience, a fairly minimal process. I mean, you're looking at, less than, I would say, 30 hours a year for that whole endeavor, for, soliciting projects, prioritizing them depending on, who's involved in that, and then making the awards, and then doing a little bit of follow-up to make sure that the dollars are being spent appropriately. I think that it could be really as little as 30, 40 hours a year for something like that once the fund itself is developed. But I know, like at UCSC, theirs is a much more arduous process. So there's a lot more involved. They have student administrators of the fund, and they have like a board that oversees the fund. So it seems like that model requires much more capacity. But again, once a fund's developed, and that's something that you need to keep in mind when you're developing the fund, is what kind of funding mechanism would reduce, or fund revenue stream would have the least administrative burden. Something like, the cap coal greenhouse gas exchange credits, I would say, would be a higher administrative burden, because you need to work with a broker potentially, or you need to be constantly advertising your credits for sale, that kind of thing. So I think it really depends on the selection. And it's funny, I didn't mention the Green Revolving Loan Fund, but UCSC actually is piloting a Green Revolving Loan Fund, taking a portion of their carbon fund dollars. And I know a lot of agencies do that. There's a lot of municipalities in Silicon Valley and across California that do Green Revolving Loan Funds. So that's definitely another model that I haven't discussed, but it certainly exists.
Great, thanks so much, Tiffany. I know we're going a little over. We have a few more questions. Most of these we'll ask you to respond to separately by email. But I do want to ask Sean's question, who we didn't get a chance to hear from. So Sean is managing the San Francisco Carbon Fund. They found it very expensive to verify offsets, particularly as the legislation requires all projects be local. Do any of the projects purchase official offsets that are verified?
Yes, the Monterey Bay Carbon Fund does both verified and voluntary offsets. We did evaluate verification when we were looking at offset development for Watsonville, and that was one of the things that killed it for them. It was too expensive, and so that's certainly something to consider. Same thing for Appalachian offsets. We actually had in our scope to evaluate verification for them, and they ultimately decided not to verify. They decided to actually verify through a university. They had a connection with a professor, and they felt that that was appropriate. It obviously doesn't, that's not truly official here in California to do something like that. That wouldn't really count as verification. But they felt that that was sufficient. So yeah, that is something that has killed that offset development as a potential revenue stream for several of the agencies we work with.
Great, thanks so much, Tiffany, and thank you for taking the time to present on this really engaging and informative topic. I think this past year, or this past hour, was hopefully valuable to all of our participants. And of course, thank you to everyone for participating in this webinar, especially for folks hanging on a little later. I know we're a little over time. As a reminder, the webinar recording, the PDF of today's presentation, and responses to any unanswered questions will be shared in a follow-up email. And if you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask Tiffany, feel free to send those directly to me or to Tiffany, and we can include that in the document. And that concludes this webinar. Thank you again, and we hope that you can tune in next time.
Thanks, everyone.